You're probably like me, that in your education, you learned that this man was a really, really great man and his message was really, really good. But for some reason, in all your years of education, you probably heard relatively little from the speeches that were actually recorded, even though this archive is very extensive. So maybe you don't have the perception of what he actually said. Well, today I'm going to remedy that. Let's dive right in. Well, the first thing that caught my eye was the signs themselves. They're pre-made signs, and they have a lot of definitive statements to give us an idea of the actual goals of this march. Let's read them. So we've got, we demand equal rights now. We've got civil rights plus full employment equals freedom. Interesting definition of freedom to include employment and full employment. Then we have, we demand voting rights now. Okay. We demand an end to police brutality now. Familiar. We march for jobs for all now. We demand an end to police brutality again. And we demand effective civil rights laws now. Okay. We've got in the front row some of the jobs for all, integrated schools, and then we have signs saying an FEPC law now. This is a bit misleading, actually. The FEPC laws actually came out in the 1940s, early 1940s, so the sign's a couple decades late to the party. But what it could mean, potentially, is that he's looking for FEPC laws to be enforced more, because employers couldn't always be motivated. Kind of a union struggle between white workers who liked keeping their jobs and black workers who wanted those jobs. So ultimately, the unions of the white workers were keeping some sway, especially political sway. And keep in mind, too, I'll talk more about job statistics later on because there's a lot interesting. But 20s and 30s, actually, it's reported in our census data that the black people of America had a higher percentage employment than white people did for the 20s and 30s at least. But it had at that point changed. So we were starting to see black unemployment on the rise, and it's kept on the rise. It's always kept up in comparison since then compared to white employment. So at least a lot of the older people here had lived through the era in which they had a higher percentage of jobs. It's just that they did have the lower pay, so it's more accurate that they're looking for higher pay necessarily than just fair employment. Zooming in, we have Catholic, Jews, Protestant marching together. We have decent housing now. Interesting, I guess decent housing, not bad, but can you demand housing of who? Government? Government's going to provide housing? I mean, of course now it does. An end to bias now. Now that's the most ambitious sign yet. Integrated schools. Then here we have jobs for all plus a decent pay. And zooming way into the back, we have a higher minimum wage coverage for all workers now. Sounds kind of $15 an hour.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, the great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity.
Now, just to burst the bubble a little bit here, the Emancipation Proclamation, as it's known, which is not the title really, it's Proclamation 95, it did not free the slaves. We do have laws on the book now, thanks to the 13th Amendment, against slavery, except as punishment for a crime. However, this Emancipation Proclamation itself, it specifically did not free all U.S. slaves. What it more explicitly did was exclusively free slaves within the Confederate States that Lincoln identified as in rebellion. It did not free slaves within the Union states that were loyal border states. These border states with slaves were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and later West Virginia, the new state. In this way, it's clear that this is a political approach, actually, where forcing the conformity of the Confederacy is more important than freeing slaves. Additionally, we do not get any indication of those freed being then full citizens. Ultimately, these people are not given any particular rights beyond freedom to be free, and that is only dependent upon the Confederate States first being conquered. Now, to be fair, we do get a passage that explains a potential unity for the then freed slaves with the Union itself. And this passage reads as this: "And I further declare and make known that such a person of suitable condition will be received into the armed services of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said services." This, though, at the same time, does indicate the primary impetus behind such a declaration at that time, which was in service of a war effort. So ultimately, this is yet another nail in the old Civil War was about slavery argument. Certainly, when the vast majority of people fighting the war are poor, independent farmers, not the tiny percentage that were the actual owners of slaves, legally speaking, that was 1.4% of Southerners, then we shouldn't be surprised that the Emancipation Proclamation is actually more concerned about putting down rebellions and building up their forces against the South than actually ending slavery. It's far more accurate to say that the South did not want to be taxed excessively or let the North push them around through federal action despite having a very different economy. And Southerners were looking for any way they could to gain political representation, again, despite the Northern states gaining a much larger population, especially through immigration. That sounds familiar. So what is free? Well, Lincoln was a member of the Back to Africa movement, and you don't get freer than getting a free ride back to your ancestral homeland to escape your white oppressors, right? So I'm sure now that Lincoln would not be celebrating you as you stand in front of his statue. He'd be saying, "Why have these Negroes not been removed from my monument yet, or from the country that we have built? They most surely would be more free in Africa, as our good Lord intended."
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation.
In my previous video on civil rights, I noted that Rustin was the effective organizer of this march, as many writers would write now. However, his association at that point was meant to be kept fairly secret, as him being too prominent within the movement gave very real ammunition to the Strom Thurmond, as well as other politicians claiming that the marches were being organized by a noted homosexual, communist, and draft dodger, which Rustin is openly all three, though he was within a socialist group early on, for what difference that would be in comparison to communism. Now, for the sake of comparison and evaluation, here's a picture of the official organizer, Philip A. Randolph, and here's him seemingly getting a standing snooze while Rustin speaks. Do you see Randolph in this footage that I'm going over? I've reviewed the video of this march, and he is there marching in the beginning, but for the speech itself, I have not yet seen him. I find that possibly telling. He was on the older side, but in contrast, Rustin really looks the part of right-hand man during the speech if you watch him.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later.
King, would you mind refuting yourself here?
Now, we are poor people. Individually, we are poor when you compare us with white society in America. We are poor. Never stop. Forget that collectively, that means all of us together, collectively we are richer than all the nations in the world with the exception of 9. Did you ever think about that? After you leave the United States, Soviet Russia, Great Britain, West Germany, France, I can name others. The American Negro collectively is richer than most nations of the world. We have an annual income of more than $30 billion a year, which is more than all of the exports of the United States and more than the national budget of Canada. Did you know that? That's power right there if we know how to prove it.
Thank you, King. So let's look at the average family wealth by race ethnicity for this year, 1963, and onwards. Best we can tell, though, the statistics have changed. This wealth gap that they identify is actually growing between white people and black people, though they're going to also note these Hispanic people, and let's talk about that too. First, some aspects that should be included to keep this chart more honest in context. This average, like many of the most extreme wealth gaps you've heard of before, comes from a household, which means that this compares the income of many dual-earning households to single parents or just single people. Well, looking at these statistics by race, black people have a huge problem with single-parent households. There's very little that could be done about this, especially from outside their community, though along a historical timeline, integration certainly didn't help. King said that increased economic support would lead to a decrease in the breakup of families, and the exact opposite has happened. Also, this wealth gap would compare white people who are more employed to black people who are less employed. However, we now have extensive welfare, so we're now in a situation where one racial group is getting a lot of financial support on average for less work on average. Simultaneously, black communities will be on average taxed less, and more taxes are applied on the white population to pay for these exact programs. Also note the Hispanic and black wealth comparison, which we don't hear about as often. Funnily enough, there's a lot of similar wealth in this method of calculation, but black people commit far more murders than Hispanics. More violent crime, more crime in general, except for DUIs, which Hispanics lead in. Hispanics don't have the crime levels that black people do. We also don't see the riots from the Hispanic communities over criminals getting shot or wealth inequality. I've seen them joining in some of the rioting and looting recently, but what I'm looking at, their participation seems to be lower than their demographic percentage in those particular cities. This is also interesting because if school led directly to wealth, then we would expect Hispanics to maintain far lower wealth than black people. Their high school dropout rate is far higher. But if wealth and criminality come from a mix of intelligence and culture instead of school, then we can at least better explain these criminal differences and say that there's very little we can do from outside of these communities to change them, especially forcing people through school that do not earn it through merit. So this makes me wonder, what is the correct amount of wealth that they want? Well, already in 1963, they have more than most of the world, and King is at least fully aware of that and preaching it to this entire movement. But it's the white communities that look nicer. It's them that earn more. It's the white communities that build more, even in King's time where that wealth gap looked smaller than it does now.
The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds.
Interesting phrasing there. Whichever American was to fall there. And this is a promissory note for all men, really. Well, let's look at the Constitution. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Our posterity. That means for ourselves and our own future generations. It's strictly possessive because we're saying ourselves. And usually posterity does mean your direct descendants. Well, you want to look at the race of the founding fathers, the people who are writing this? Do you think that your people who were enslaved by some of these founding fathers, do you think that they were considered the posterity? No, of course not. They're not the posterity. They're not the ourselves of this document. Do I have to go further? I mean, from the very, very beginning of the Constitution, we are given the exclusionary idea that these are the blessings of liberty for the us that is these founding fathers, for their generations, for their people. This is by no means to be conflated at all with anyone at all who would just happen to fall here, who would happen to be on this land for an extended period of time. And especially when we look at these people and what they considered as the racial composition that they desired for their own nation. But let's go on to some relevant parts, just to be fair here. So, Article 1, Section 9, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. Okay, so migration, and the migration was initially established and controlled by states. However, Congress would receive new powers to control that migration in 1808. Of course, they did soon after that period, where we had the Page Act of 1875, which was the first federal exclusionary act, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act, both of which focused on a racial issue to stop low-wage foreign immigrants and cultural decay, namely, in that case, Chinese prostitution. Another one, Constitution Article 4, Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So now we also have the role of the federal government to protect states from invasion, because right now we can, of course, note to what extent other states are allowing an invasion that some states absolutely do not want. But particularly, this has been made apparent when we see a lot of domestic violence that the states are not maintaining and controlling. Do another document? Here's the Declaration of Independence. He says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinion of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Read in full, the way that the equality of men is ensured explicitly here is through separation. Impel them to separation and to secure these rights. This should not surprise us, because just think about it. Throughout human history, life and liberty have been pursued through separation. Only in 1950s twisted logic was liberty thought to be achieved through greater integration, dependency. That seems to counter liberty, doesn't it? It's almost Orwellian. And the issue is determining what exactly is owed to MLK here. Anything at all. You're not the posterity. You are a unique people, a people who desire their own communities, and you're precisely not seeking the separation that early Americans fought for to ensure the equality. And another thing from MLK, he says insufficient funds. So you're quite clearly saying not that you have been given nothing, but that it's not enough.
But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great bulks of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual.
Hold up there, King. That sounds like a threat. It sounds like a threat of continued riots unless we cave in, we give in to demands. And you're at the same time washing your hands of this, saying that they are justified angers. But we need to ask ourselves then, how justified were these riots really? And even here, you should have a clue from what King has just said alone. He doesn't say that white and black people are letting off some steam, white and black people are having violence. He already says that the Negro is letting off some steam this last summer. Well, let's look more carefully instead at the riot history that King is really speaking about. We'll start with 1963, the actual summer that he's talking about, and see to what extent this makes sense. And this will be one of the longer segments of my video, so you can consider skipping that if you would like, but I think you guys will be really interested to actually hear what set off these riots and to what extent they were or were not justified. Let's start with the 1963 riot in Cambridge. It started with a sit-in at Disneyland restaurant, and so technically that was a segregated space, technically a space that could be defended then, but you have your moral debate for whether it's okay to defend that type of space or not from outsiders. News might claim that white patrons targeted the black sit-in participants, but as you see on screen, the only photos I've found so far of this particular event show attacks on the white sit-in participants up until the arrest came. That might seem like a minor detail, but it does show white community infighting, being people who valued separation versus those who did not value it as applied to their community. And as I will go through in terms of black nationalism versus the more globalistic approach of civil rights, the same was true with black nationalists versus civil rights leaders. You could even consider the time that a black woman stabbed MLK. But for this riot only right now, the shocking violence is yet to come. Also, there's a large crowd of black people outside and a report that this crowd engaged in a 10-minute brawl with white people prior to the cops coming in and breaking it up. So revising history to say that violence was one-sided, and especially here where there was already an element of intimidation going on, it really ignores to what extent this looked like a group invasion, which further inspired mob mentalities. Following that event, larger marching protests and counter-protests of several hundred remained peaceful due to the police separating and dispersing both groups. After the calm, though, 3 white people were seriously injured when shot close to their homes with a shotgun. This included a 12-year-old boy victim. Due to suspect descriptions, 8 black men were brought in for questioning, after which gunfire erupted from both sides with a car of white people firing as well as black people from the street. Arrests made later of the car of white people. Yes, the main violence of this riot erupted with hunting of an innocent 12-year-old white boy and 2 other men. After those arrests were made, some calm followed, but then afterwards, a Black Power activist, Hubert Gerald Brown, aggravated further by threatening to burn the whole city if his demands were not met. For reference now, Hubert Gerald Brown, also known as H-Rap Brown or Jamil Abdullah Alamin, was the 5th chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the 1960s. Well, so much for that non-violence. And he would do this constantly again in 1967, pictured. Moving on, still in 1963, the Birmingham riot. The Birmingham riot of 1963 started with bombings at 80 King's residence and Gaston Motel. Amazingly, though, no one was killed, including all 5 of 80 King's children and wife. That's 7 people who escaped both the explosion and the fires unharmed within a single level house, even claiming that the 2 adults were in that living room we can see through the big hole in the wall. However, it only took the seconds for Roosevelt Tatum to witness the explosion and run around back, seeing the entire family with young children in tow already outside. The 2 main claims that made the riot form quickly was that police were involved in the bombing and that the Klan was involved. For the police accusation, there was one witness, Roosevelt Tatum, who waited to talk to the FBI outside the 80 King residence, and he claimed the lie detector test was rigged later on. Tatum also claimed there were 2 police officers in car 49, which was a car in the area that reportedly responded to this exact bombing. Contemporary sources now claim that 2 officers actually responded to that scene from the car 49, but the FBI investigation of the time with police confirmation there and then indicated that on patrol that night only 1 officer was in car 49. August 29th, 1963, a grand jury cleared the police of all these accusations. For the Klan accusation, Brian McFall of the FBI had a Klan informant, Gary Rowe. Rowe told McFall, his FBI handler, that black Muslims had perpetrated a false flag bombing in order to blame the Klan. McFall was initially suspicious, but for some reason, the FBI did not keep as close of tabs on the black Muslims to confirm this. In submitting his final report to J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, McFall did not identify the Klan as potentially responsible for the bombing, nor did he question the credibility of Rowe as an informant. And so now you can just decide for yourself if you believe this was a false flag attack. It certainly walks like a duck and talks like a duck so far from the evidence I've given you. Now, backing up a bit though, a crowd formed quickly around police trying to investigate and began throwing rocks and other objects at police, accusing them of being involved. Keep in mind, Tatum's statement to FBI came 6 weeks after the explosion, though from his prior statements, his wife and then A.D. King and Paul Greenberg were the first people he had told about the bombing, and for King and Greenberg especially, that was also weeks after the bombing. After these crowds were throwing rocks at police and rioting immediately after the bombing. There was then a lot more violence and destruction throughout the city, which eventually the federal government intervened on, with some very interesting historical accounts in writing here. Kennedy's opinion in Birmingham was, as quoted, "The people who've gotten out of hand are not the white people, but the Negroes by and large." Malcolm X later said in his well-known message to the grassroots speech, "By the way, right at that time Birmingham had exploded, and the Negroes in Birmingham, remember, they also exploded. They began to stab the crackers in the back and bust them upside their head." Yes, they did. That's when Kennedy sent in the troops down in Birmingham. So, and right after that, Kennedy got on television and said, "This is a moral issue." Additionally, declassified recordings of a White House meeting on May 12th, 1963 are often cited in support of this view. Robert Kennedy, the Negro Reverend Walker, he said that the Negroes, when dark comes tonight, they're going to start going after the policemen, headhunting, trying to shoot to kill policemen. He says it's completely out of hand. You could trigger off a good deal of violence around the country now with Negroes saying they've been abused for all these years and they're going to follow the ideas of the black Muslims now. If they feel, on the other hand, that the federal government is their friend, that is intervening for them, that is going to work for them, then it will head some of that off. I think that's the strongest argument for doing something. So already for this summer, 1963, King's justifiable riots include hunting white people, including a child, and what certainly looks like a false flag attack. But I am finding this very interesting, so let's keep going. 1964, Harlem riot for James Powell. July 16th, 1964, the gardener was watering the plants across several buildings. There were summer session students standing on the street, leaning on cars and buildings and such. According to claims, the gardener either sprayed some of the students on purpose or accident. Enraged, the mob of students started throwing bottles and garbage can lids at him, chasing the gardener into building 215. An off-duty officer heard breaking glass and responded at the scene. He found Powell yelling, hit him, hit him, hit him, and holding a knife. Drawing his gun and badge in left hand, the officer yelled commands to drop the knife and back away. Instead, James Powell lunged at the officer with the knife after seeing the badge, and the officer shot him twice, killing him. Many black witnesses were interviewed and gave conflicting accounts, including some stating that Powell had several knives, letting them be borrowed and taking one knife back before the shooting, while stating that he wanted to cut the redacted name. They also found the knife close to the body. Of course, though, riots were inspired by rumors that Powell was laughing, didn't do anything, and didn't have a knife. This resulted in 6 consecutive nights of rioting. After about 500 persons were injured, 1 man died, which was a rioter, and 465 men and women were arrested. Property damage was estimated to be between $500,000 and $1 million. I have left names redacted on this one, though they are easy to find, as names are redacted in the official report because the officer in question was fully cleared of all charges by unanimous jury, including 2 black jurors. Further, the officer brought a libel suit against civil rights activists, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and James Farmer, alleging that they were responsible for printing and distributing a handbill with his name, with his picture, and the caption, "Wanted for Murder." At the same time, the redacted name also brought a libel suit against the Congress of Racial Equality, the Progressive Labor Movement, and the Harlem Defense Council. The suit alleged that these groups had conspired and maliciously and willfully participated in a plan to defame his good name and reputation. So just if you ever wanted an indication that King would have been in support of Jacob Blake, Michael Brown, etc., well, there it is. 1964 Rochester riot. The Rochester Police Department attempted to arrest an intoxicated black male at a street block party and dance on Joseph Street in the Upper Falls neighborhood of Rochester. Police found 20-year-old Randy Manigault unruly and disorderly. They determined that he was intoxicated and attempted to arrest him. Manigault became combative and resisted arrest. Bystanders felt police were too forceful and began to interject themselves and started throwing bottles and bricks at police. Police then called for backup from the RPD, with a K-9 unit responding due to a shortage of other officers. Peace was restored after 3 days, and only after Governor Nelson Rockefeller called out the New York National Guard. By the time the disturbance was over, 5 were dead, 4 in a helicopter crash, and 350 injured. Almost 1,000 people were arrested, and 204 stores were either looted or damaged. Although the riot was initially blamed on outside agitators, almost all the rioters arrested were from the local area, with only 14 people arrested who resided outside Monroe County. Next up, my favorite, 1964 Dixmoor Race Riot, or Gin Bottle Riot. Blondella Woods was shoplifting from a liquor store. The store owner first wrestled her to the ground, and she was then arrested. Black residents disliked this, began protesting the store, and ended up throwing things and trying to harm random passing motorists. 1964 Philadelphia Race Riot. The unrest began on the evening of August 28th after a black woman named Odessa Bradford got into an argument with 2 police officers, one black, Robert Wells, and the other white, John Hoff, because Bradford stopped her car while arguing with her boyfriend and refused to move out of the intersection at 23rd Street and Columbia Avenue. The officers then tried to physically remove Bradford from the car. As the argument went on, a large crowd assembled in the area. A man tried to come to Bradford's aid by attacking the police officers at the scene. Both he and Bradford were arrested. Rumors then spread throughout North Philadelphia that a pregnant black woman had been beaten to death by white police officers. That didn't happen, of course. She was quite alive and not even sure she was pregnant. Later that evening, and throughout the next 2 days, angry mobs looted and burned mostly white-owned businesses in North Philadelphia, mainly along Columbia Avenue. Outnumbered, the police response was to withdraw from the area rather than aggressively confront the rioters. Although no one was killed, 341 people were injured, 774 people were arrested, and 225 stores were damaged or destroyed in the 3 days of rioting. Some of the tension was attributable to religion, with black Muslims and black nationalists pitted against black Baptist ministers who called for calm. Well, now with a riot history like this, and the start of the riots being so often from black people, you can read the whole list and just see how often they were starting the tensions. spreading rumors, spreading lies, especially if you get into 1967, those riots. I think you can get a good idea of why King died with a 75% disapproval rating. It all sounds very familiar, and it was not the full story of this movement that we're told now of just peaceful marches and evil white people responding.
There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro has granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges.
If I can show you anything through the riots and crime statistics of the time, it's that the peaceful protests that King famously wanted were absolutely not the entire story. While at the same time, he's speaking out of the other side of his mouth, reminding white people that violence will continue if demands are not met. But the black community isn't peaceful now, they weren't peaceful then, and they weren't peaceful as far back as evidence we have goes. So we have every reason to believe, especially in King's time, that the black community was demonstrating constantly with these exact kind of events why it would be dangerous to integrate with them. Now, a lot of this is happening in the more northern, more liberal kind of states, the more integrated spaces, though, especially. Even if you think they deserve more funding, more jobs, you can put yourself into the shoes of a parent at the time who saw these actions and said, my child is innocent. This is only more dangerous to try sharing spaces, just as even the founding fathers recognized. And just think of the logic of these statements. The logic King is giving us goes something like, my community is rightfully angry and have unfortunately been committing many acts of violence and destroying your cities. If you let us in, though, to your community and also give us more things we feel we deserve, then of course we'll stop destroying. I pinky swear on that. Promise. You guys are making fun of Democratic mayors now for using this logic, opening the gates and kowtowing so that rioters and general violence would calm down.
That is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must be able to conduct our struggle on the high planes of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our trained protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their
allies of the time. Quick tip to anyone who wants to be an ally for a multiracial society. Allies in Haiti, in South Africa, or let's even be honest, white people in American cities during race riots, you will suffer. In the case of Haiti, the allies were wholesale raped and murdered. In South Africa, the main political party are often singing a song about killing white farmers. Yet, for the MSM, I'm supposed to believe that there aren't genocides in South Africa against these white people, ancestors potentially of allies, or if they're old enough, the actual allies of the end of apartheid. This is just to say, King noting the participation of white people in this movement does not mean that the population at large will ever like your race, King included.
They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone.
So first, this cannot walk alone in reference to white people is very interesting in how incapable the phrasing makes these black communities sound. Consider not just white people, consider the Native Americans and their reservations, and as we've covered, King knows that his community is richer than all but 9 nations in the world. Yet the poor Native Americans maintain more independence, and I would say, therefore, more freedom by maintaining a boundary for themselves. They don't seem to feel that they need as much help as the black people do. Consider Ireland, consider the Catalonians. How many minorities in the world, even extremely small minorities with relatively small civilizations, believe that they are better off walking on their own? Particularly in this word selection, it sounds like black people need to have their hand held, lacking the confidence to do this on their own.
As we walk, We must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is a victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied. As long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the city. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote.
Now, if this sounds familiar, the black community is not satisfied as long as they get this perception of police brutality. However, as I've highlighted in the origin of a lot of these riots, this accusation of police brutality back then could often be filled with falsehoods. And that was a lot of the problem. Certainly the media was complicit in this, but the black community and the media spread a lot of misinformation before proper investigations went through. And so as a result, actual accusations of police brutality could be overshadowed by this spread of falsehoods, meaning that even then, truth was pushed less than racial grievances. Think about it. Even in Philadelphia, having a policy of one black and one white police officer in patrol for black neighborhoods caused a riot in the 1960s for their completely justified actions. Just like the liberal policies of New York caused riots also. And then we have other problems to consider for the satisfaction that King is looking for, one being the voting. So he says a black man in the South can't vote. Okay, fine, that is a legal consideration. Now, what he says next, though, is a huge problem for his entire argument. He says a man in the North, in New York, black man in New York, feels that he has nothing for which to vote for. So you see the problem, and I think King sees it too, because in contrast, he offers no solution to that, because he knows that there's no ready solution. In fact, what he's suggesting, integration, runs completely counter to that. It makes no sense at all to have diversity when it comes to voting. It makes far more sense for ethnic groups to gather together, gather power, gather numbers, so that they can get the representation that they would want for their particular location. Giving full civil rights to black people does not accomplish this in a diverse society. They can't just feel like they are the majority. They can't just feel like they're being represented or that they are getting the particular benefits that they would want to vote for, because naturally politicians are going to cater to what's going to get their votes. And if you're a disparate group, just like in New York, where we're always having disparate groups and absolutely no one is happy, well, no one gets anything. And the politicians just get to do absolutely whatever they want. So King's really demonstrating here why his goal of integration is completely counter and not at all helpful to either the white population or actually to the black population either.
No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friend,
Let's get into this. Go back. It's very particular, very interesting. Go back to where you were, back to slums and ghettos. Okay, so again, it's a reverse exodus. Further asking for the issues of the bad part of town to be remedied. But what if, just if, the bad part of town is the result of the people of the town? If it were not a bad part of town as a result of people living there, even with help, then this black community of millions would be more than capable of building up separately, embracing an exodus of some kind, rather than being encouraged to further implant, not just into America, but into the communities that King is identifying as the most racist of all, actually. Well, consider that. If King really believed that these places were so racist, then how could he morally encourage his people to go back there? It's dangerous. We're given first the idea that there's a particular danger of being black in a dangerous white area. But King doesn't seem to think that, given his encouragement, and even with federal laws, wouldn't he ultimately believe that white people there would continue to find ways to keep black people out of higher earning employment? This encouragement only works not just with him believing that you can legislate out in-group preference, but almost immediately remove what he identifies as harsh racism. But returning to the first consideration, if the bad part of town is a result of the people who live in that town, then of course, then you have no particular escape, no matter what the situation is. The slums and ghettos are not defined by just some aspect of architecture here and there. They're defined by the people that live there, and those communities are made a little bit safer, a little bit less safe, depending on the community, actually.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners, will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood? I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
A couple things here. First, so he's repeating there's particularly racist parts of the country. These would be the parts of the country with the most experience with black people, though. The largest populations of black people within those states. So what is that? Other than judging a group that you've learned more about the content of their group's character, at least. We therefore shouldn't really be surprised when we're looking into cities and finding some of the most intense racial identities coming out of cities where many ethnic groups are living very close to each other and having to interact with each other, potentially against their will.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification.
Now this I find particularly disgusting. King considers interposition and nullification and says they're just such venomous words. Well, what's interposition? It's a claimed right of a U.S. state to oppose actions of the federal government that the state deems unconstitutional. Under the theory of interposition, a state assumed the right to interpose itself between the federal government and the people of the state by taking action to prevent the federal government from enforcing laws that the state considers unconstitutional. Nullification? Very similar. In United States constitutional theory is a legal theory that a state has the right to nullify or invalidate any federal law which that state has deemed unconstitutional with respect to the United States Constitution, as opposed to the state's own constitution. So just consider in your gut and consider what states are doing now. Were either of these legal scenarios ever wrong? Certainly the states, you would think, should have the right to do this. This was a lot of the guarantee of states' rights. They would have a good deal of say in representing the will of their own people. And especially if we can say that the states did indeed have a constitutional reason to do and say what they did. Especially in terms of this ruling, did the state government have a sound constitutional argument? For a contemporary comparison, we had Obama trying to give citizenship to millions that weren't supposed to be here, and Democrats have expressed plans to push more of that. Ultimately, the federal government can't just make massive groups of people legal residents of this country, give them privileges, even if they are physically inside it. No doubt that black people in America had arrived through largely different means from the white population and had not been granted the same citizenship, especially due to the original immigration laws. And now consider that the theory, though, the argument itself is what King is more against. The argument of constitutional and state rights. King is making it clear, therefore, that what he sees as particularly wrong on its own is white people having the ability to say no, or to argue for what they believe to be their own constitution.
One day right down in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country tears of thee." Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Bold words there. America can't be a great nation if it doesn't have freedom. But your freedom, well, that's an odd definition. And I just want to get to the crux of the matter here. It will always be your freedom to be incorporated into another society, to benefit from that society, versus my freedom to be away from you. And in that way, you are stealing freedom, a whole lot of freedom, from my community. You're denying peace in my community while demanding that my community pay you more and more and more for the benefit of more violence, more chaos, and even more disunity that doesn't really help your community either. And in this way, in this very simple way where we are just listening to King's actual words, what I'm getting at is that this clown world that we're talking about now, these Orwellian words, this is not new. King, this period, was already defining freedom as integration, dependency, which are not at all freedom. They were already defining liberty as two very different groups of people being bound together. You see, it's all right here in the speeches themselves, in the context of the time, as by the time that King came to prominence, the roots of Clown World had already been well planted, and for King's message to go forward, he had to change definitions to their exact opposite meaning.
So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.